The traffic stop that changed everything. Maya Whittaker adjusted her blazer in the mirror, the crisp navy fabric reflecting the soft morning light streaming through her small Brooklyn apartment window. It was a Thursday, typically a day of endless case reviews, brief filings, and client meetings at the Department of Justice's Eastern District office. She had her usual routine down to a science: coffee brewing while she showered, a light breakfast of yogurt and fruit, then a brisk walk to the subway station, blending seamlessly into the river of morning commuters. But today was different. A last-minute call had come in the night before, requesting her presence at a legal outreach event in Queens. Normally, Maya would have taken the subway across the boroughs, but the errand's unpredictability convinced her to drive. She appreciated the flexibility the car offered, the freedom to stop for coffee, the ability to decompress in silence between appointments. There was something comforting about R&B humming softly from the speakers, the low croon of Marvin Gaye's voice filling her car as she drove through the narrow, bustling streets of Brooklyn. Maya had been navigating these streets all her life. Born and raised in Crown Heights, she knew every shortcut, every bodega owner, every corner where kids played double dutch until the streetlights flickered on. Her world was a mosaic of culture and resilience, shaped by the strength of her parents, her mother, a tireless social worker, and her father, a retired history professor whose passion for civil rights had shaped her own sense of justice. Her car rolled smoothly through the neighborhood, past the familiar brownstones and corner stores, until she merged onto Atlantic Avenue. Traffic was heavy but manageable. She obeyed every sign, eased through every crosswalk, her mind half on her day's schedule and half on the quiet unease she always felt driving alone. Being a black woman behind the wheel in New York City was never just driving. It was performance art. Hands at 10 and 2, perfect posture, a silent prayer that today would not be that day. The day where flashing lights and a loudspeaker shattered the normalcy of her commute. Today it was. The wail of a siren split the air behind her. Red and blue lights flickered in her rearview mirror. Maya felt her heart lurch into her throat. Instinctively, she flicked her blinker, signaling her compliance as she eased her car toward the curb. The neighborhood around her was already awake. Shop owners unlocking their doors, parents walking children to school, and she felt the weight of every pair of eyes watching. She knew the drill. Windows down, hands visible, breath even. Still, her pulse thundered in her ears. Two officers emerged from the squad car, walking in step like they were born to command the pavement. One was wiry and pale, his sunken eyes framed by a thin mustache that curled at the edges. Officer Troy Millstone. The other, heavier set, his reddish skin stretched tight across his face, was Officer Kevin Rourke. Neither of them smiled. License, registration, insurance. Millstone barked, his tone absent of pretense or politeness. "Good morning, officer," Maya said, keeping her voice light, even though her hands trembled slightly as she gathered her documents. "Can I ask why I'm being stopped?" Millstone snatched the papers from her fingers without responding, flipping through them with exaggerated nonchalance. Rourke loomed by her passenger window, peering inside like a predator inspecting prey. "You were speeding back there," Millstone said at last. 45 and a 30. Maya frowned slightly, but kept her expression neutral. "I don't believe I was, officer. I was keeping pace with traffic and watching for pedestrians." Millstone's lips curled into a smirk. "You calling me a liar?" "No, sir," Maya replied, her voice honey smooth. "I'm just asking for clarification." That was enough to shift the air. Rourke's eyes narrowed, his bulk shifting closer to the car. "Step out of the vehicle," he said. "Is there a specific reason you need me to step out?" Maya asked, though she already knew it didn't matter. The demand was not a request. It was a litmus test. They wanted to see if she'd push back, if she would question her place in the hierarchy they had crafted for women like her. Millstone grinned. "Because I said so." Maya's grip on the steering wheel tightened. Every lesson her parents taught her about compliance rang through her head like a mantra. Don't escalate. Don't argue. Stay calm. Live. She unbuckled her seatbelt, the click echoing louder than it should in the tense silence, and stepped onto the sidewalk. A few pedestrians slowed their pace, their eyes flickering toward her and the officers. No one lingered long. New Yorkers understood the danger of staring too long at trouble. Rourke spun her around without warning, pressing her hands against the cool metal of her car. His hands were rough, his search perfunctory but invasive, sweeping her legs, her sides, her arms. Maya bit the inside of her cheek to keep from shaking. She was intimately familiar with every line of constitutional law governing search and seizure. The Fourth Amendment's promise felt laughably far away in that moment. "What's in the car?" Millstone asked, his head already half inside the back seat. "Just work documents," Maya answered. "Nothing illegal." "We'll see about that," Rourke muttered. They rifled through her belongings, scattering her neatly organized folders and briefcase contents across the seats. Maya watched the papers flutter, her case notes now littered across upholstery. They didn't ask permission. They didn't have probable cause. They didn't care. The humiliation burned her throat, but she swallowed it down. Compliance was survival. After 15 minutes of pointless rummaging, they found nothing. Millstone emerged, slamming the door with unnecessary force. "Write her up," he said. "For what?" Maya asked, her voice low but steady. "Speeding. And maybe resisting an officer." His grin was razor-sharp. "I didn't resist," Maya said, her composure slipping just a fraction. Rourke shrugged. "Our word against yours." The implied threat wasn't subtle. It was a promise. One backed by the weight of their badges and the system that had shielded them from accountability for years. But what they didn't know, couldn't have known, was who Maya Whittaker really was. They saw a black woman in business clothes driving a sit-in. They saw someone expendable, someone they could bully without consequence. They didn't see the assistant United States attorney, the woman who had memorized case law like scripture, who had prosecuted financial criminals and civil rights violators with unflinching precision. They didn't see the woman who carried the weight of her ancestors' struggle on her shoulders, who had vowed never to let injustice go unchallenged. They didn't know, but they would soon. As they handed her the summons, the ink barely dry, Maya accepted it with a polite smile that didn't touch her eyes. Her rage was a coiled thing, buried deep beneath layers of discipline. But it simmered. "Have a nice day," Millstone sneered. Maya slipped back into her car, her trembling hands gripping the wheel. She waited until they were gone before exhaling, her breath sharp and shaky. Her reflection in the rearview mirror stared back at her, controlled, composed, but smoldering with righteous fury. She didn't drive away immediately. Instead, she pulled out her phone, opened the voice memo app, and began to record every detail. The officers' names, the time, the place, their words, her exact responses. She knew how these stories usually ended, her word against theirs. But she wasn't just any black woman behind the wheel. She was Maya Whittaker, a U.S. attorney with a devastating secret weapon, the truth and the law. And when she walked into that courtroom, they would all find out exactly who they were dealing with. Silence is not an option. The summons sat on Maya Whittaker's kitchen table like a challenge, its flimsy paper an insult to the years she'd spent mastering the law it so carelessly weaponized. The coffee in her mug had long gone cold, her reflection staring back at her in the window above the sink. There was no question in her mind. She wasn't going to let this go. She reached for her phone, fingers hovering over her contacts before dialing. "Marcus Reed," came the voice on the other end, bright and energetic despite the early hour. "Marcus," Maya began, her voice calm but steely. "I need a favor." "Dan, good morning to you too," Marcus teased, though the warmth in his voice quickly gave way to concern. "What's wrong?" Maya gave him the short version. The stop, the bogus charges, the humiliating search. She expected outrage, maybe disbelief, but Marcus only sighed heavily. Every time, he muttered. Every time they think they can get away with it. Not this time, Maya said firmly. I'm going to need your help. Quietly. You know I've got your back, Marcus assured her. What's your move? Maya leaned back in her chair, letting her mind begin to plot the warpath ahead. I need everything you can pull on Officers Millstone and Rourke. Complaints, disciplinary actions, even if they've been scrubbed clean. I want to know who filed them, and why they went nowhere. That's a big ask, Marcus said, already typing in the background. But if anyone can find those ghosts, it's me. She trusted Marcus with her life. They had made that pact back at NYU Law. Two kids from working-class families who had clawed their way into the ivory tower of federal prosecution. They had made it because they were smart, because they were relentless, and because they knew how to read between the lines of every system designed to push people like them out. When Maya ended the call, she had the first flicker of hope in her chest. Hope, however, didn't erase the knot of dread tightening with every hour that passed. In less than a week, she would have to appear in criminal court. Her name, Maya Whittaker, would appear on the docket, not as the assistant U.S. attorney she'd fought to become, but as a defendant. The irony was as bitter as it was familiar. The next morning, Maya stood in her closet, her fingers skimming past the bold power suits she normally wore to court. Today, she chose softer armor. A slate blue blouse tucked into high-waisted trousers, her natural curls pulled into a sleek bun at the nape of her neck. She wasn't dressing to intimidate. Not yet. Today, she needed to look unthreatening, compliant, the picture of a respectable professional. It was exhausting, playing the game, but she knew its rules better than anyone. She rode the subway into Manhattan, standing shoulder to shoulder with tired commuters, the heat of their bodies soaking into her skin. No one knew who she was here. Not the officers at the turnstile, not the teenager rapping softly to himself beside her. Here, she was just another face. At the Department of Justice, however, she was anything but. Whittaker. A voice called as she stepped through security. Jennifer Robles, her closest colleague, jogged to catch up with her. You didn't answer my texts. Where you been? Busy, Maya said, her smile tight. Jennifer's brow furrowed as they walked side by side toward their office. Something's wrong. Maya hesitated. Jennifer had been her friend through law school and the early years at the DOJ. They had survived late nights prepping trial binders, celebrating after their first convictions, mourning when cases fell apart. But this was personal in a way Maya wasn't sure how to share. Promise me this stays between us, Maya said, pulling her into the small break room. Jennifer's eyes widened. Of course. In hushed tones, Maya relayed everything. The stop, the search, the threats, the summons. Jennifer's face cycled from disbelief to fury to quiet heartbreak. They have no idea who they messed with, Jennifer said, her voice fierce. What are you going to do? Document. Gather evidence. Build a defense, Maya said. And when the time is right, I'll remind them exactly who I am. That afternoon, Marcus sent over the first batch of files. Subject: Millstone and Rourke. Preliminary dossier. Maya scrolled through pages of complaints, internal memos, and disciplinary reports that read like a grim anthology of abuse. 3 separate civilian complaints alleged racial profiling. 2 involved excessive force against black men during routine traffic stops. None had resulted in serious consequences. One was closed for lack of corroborating evidence. Another dismissed after a clerical error misplaced key testimony. Each line, each excuse, built the outline of a pattern Maya knew all too well. Protect the blue, bury the truth. Her pulse quickened when she reached a confidential memo from the precinct's internal review board. It warned of a growing number of racial bias complaints centered around Millstone and Rourke, but the document was stamped with a chilling phrase: no sustained finding. Insufficient evidence. Insufficient evidence. The oldest excuse in the book. Maya's stomach churned, but the anger that followed was clarifying. This wasn't just about her anymore. This was about everyone who had been pulled over for no reason, everyone who had been frisked on a sidewalk for walking while black. Millstone and Rourke weren't anomalies. They were symptoms of a disease, and Maya was ready to become the cure. The night before her court appearance, Maya spread the evidence across her kitchen table like a general plotting a battle map. Official complaints, sworn affidavits from past victims, the grainy cell phone footage from her own encounter. It was a fortress of truth built brick by brick. The hardest part, though, was the silence. She couldn't tell their parents. Her mother would lose sleep, her father would march into that courtroom himself, and Maya needed them calm. They had fought their battles. This one was hers. The phone rang, and Maya answered without checking the caller ID. "This is Detective Brian Castell with NYPD Internal Affairs," came a gruff voice. "I received a call from a mutual contact. I'd like to meet with you regarding Officers Millstone and Rourke." Maya's breath caught. Internal Affairs rarely intervened in cases like this, unless someone high up decided to take the heat off themselves by cutting loose the small fry. "Detective," Maya said, choosing her words carefully. "I'd be happy to meet, but just so you know, I'll be bringing my attorney." The next morning, Maya stood outside the Kings County Courthouse, the autumn wind slicing through her coat. Stella Moreno, her defense attorney, stood beside her, all sharp edges and quick wit. "Ready?" Stella asked. Maya squared her shoulders. "I was born ready." Inside, the courtroom was a familiar arena. She'd stood on the other side of the aisle countless times, prosecuting tax fraud, civil rights violations, and drug trafficking. Today, the label beside her name read, "Defendant." The irony wasn't lost on her. As Judge Alan Carver took his seat, Maya glanced at the prosecution's table. Millstone and Rourke sat stiffly in their uniforms, their smugness dimmed by the weight of scrutiny they hadn't expected. Their attorney whispered something, but Maya didn't care. When her case was called, Maya rose, every inch the composed professional. Not a victim, not a defendant, but a woman who had spent her entire life preparing for this fight. Her voice was clear, her stance unwavering. "Not guilty, Your Honor." The words rang out like a declaration of war. When the mask comes off, Maya Whittaker stood before the heavy wooden door of Courtroom 3B, her pulse a steady drumbeat beneath her skin. In all her years walking these halls, first as a law clerk, later as a federal prosecutor, she had never stood on this side of the process. Defendant. The label burned, but Maya had long since learned how to weaponize humiliation. Injustice was her oldest adversary, and every slight, every indignity she'd endured had shaped her into a woman with steel in her spine and fire in her chest. Stella Moreno, her defense attorney, stood beside her, all confidence and poise in a burgundy suit that was a shade too bold for a courtroom run by a judge like Alan Carver. Carver was old-school New York, former prosecutor, rumored golf buddy of half the precinct captains in Brooklyn, and infamous for taking law enforcement at their word. His bench was a place where cops rarely lost and defendants, especially ones with brown skin, were seen as little more than case numbers. "He's not going to like you," Stella muttered under her breath, smoothing an invisible wrinkle from her skirt. Maya's lips curled into a dry smile. "That makes two of us." They pushed through the doors together, the muted hum of conversation washing over them as they stepped inside. Maya's eyes swept the room with the precision of a hunter assessing the field. Officers Millstone and Rourke sat stiffly at the prosecution table, their uniforms pressed to perfection, their faces locked in identical masks of righteous indignation. The district attorney assigned to the case, Caroline Hastings, stood beside them, all business in a tailored gray suit and pearls. Hastings was competent, methodical, and most importantly, loyal to her law enforcement witnesses. Maya knew her type. Hastings would present the officers as dutiful public servants just trying to do their jobs, and Maya as the defiant troublemaker who hadn't known her place. What they didn't know, couldn't know, was that Maya wasn't playing their game. She was rewriting the rules. The bailiff called the court to order, and Judge Carver strode in, robe billowing slightly, his expression as sour as ever. His reputation preceded him, tough on defendants, lenient on cops, and allergic to anything resembling civil rights rhetoric. Docket number 24, CR 1785, the clerk announced. People of the State of New York versus Maya Whittaker. Maya stood, her chin lifted just slightly, enough to project confidence, but not defiance. Not yet. Present, Your Honor. Carver's eyes flicked to her, narrowing slightly, though he said nothing. Stella leaned closer. He's already suspicious. Let him be, Maya murmured back. We're not here to make him comfortable. Hastings rose first, outlining the state's case with the ease of someone who had done this 1,000 times. Millstone and Rourke, she said, had performed a routine traffic stop after observing Maya speeding. When they approached her vehicle, they were met with hostility, non-compliance, and verbal aggression. Maya felt her jaw clench, but she kept her face neutral. Lies told with the smoothness of practice. Hastings painted Maya as arrogant and uncooperative, someone who thought the rules didn't apply to her. When she added the phrase, combative demeanor, Maya almost laughed out loud. The phrase was practically coded language, one-size-fits-all justification for escalating force, reserved exclusively for black drivers who dared to ask, why? When Hastings finally took her seat, Stella rose with the grace of a lioness uncoiling from sleep. Your Honor, we intend to demonstrate that this case is not about resisting arrest. It's about officers abusing their authority, falsifying their account, and attempting to cover up an illegal stop. Carver's brow lifted a fraction. A warning shot, subtle but clear. Let's stick to the facts, Ms. Moreno. Absolutely, Your Honor, Stella said smoothly. The facts will speak for themselves. The first witness was Officer Millstone. He took the stand with the confident swagger of a man who had told this story enough times to believe it himself. Under Hastings' questioning, he recited the encounter in precise, clinical detail. Maya's aggressive tone, her refusal to comply, the need to secure the scene for officer safety. It was textbook. Then Stella stepped up. Officer Millstone, she began. How many years have you served with the NYPD? 15. Millstone replied. In that time, how many civilian complaints have been filed against you? Hastings leaped to her feet. Objection. Irrelevant and prejudicial. Stella kept her eyes on Millstone. Goes to credibility, Your Honor. Carver frowned, clearly displeased, but he allowed it. Keep it brief. Millstone's smile dimmed. A few complaints, all unfounded. Unfounded, Stella repeated. Do you recall a 2019 complaint filed by Mr. Jamal Hines, who alleged you unlawfully searched his vehicle during a traffic stop? I don't recall specifics, Millstone said, eyes darting slightly. Stella held up a document. It's funny, because you signed this response letter, denying any wrongdoing. Millstone's jaw tightened. Complaints happen. Doesn't mean they're true. Of course not. Stella's smile was all teeth. But if multiple complaints describe similar behavior, targeting drivers of color, escalating routine stops, would that concern you? Objection, Hastings barked. Withdrawn, Stella said, moving on before Carver could cut her off. Let's talk about the stop in question. When you approached Ms. Whittaker, how did she respond? She was defensive, Millstone said. Hostile. Did she raise her voice? Yes. Did she refuse to provide identification? No. Did she refuse to exit the vehicle when ordered? No. Stella's brow lifted. So she complied. Millstone's jaw clenched, reluctantly. Stella turned to the jury, a small gesture, but effective. Reluctant compliance is still compliance. She let the implication hang in the air. Nothing further, she said. Millstone stepped down, his confidence visibly shaken. Rourke was next, less polished, more bluster. He stumbled through his account, contradicting Millstone's testimony in small but significant ways. Millstone claimed Maya raised her voice immediately. Rourke said she was calm at first. Millstone claimed Maya resisted being searched. Rourke said she complied. Stella pounced on every inconsistency, weaving them into a portrait of unreliable witnesses whose story shifted to fit their narrative. Then came the moment Maya had waited for, her own testimony. She took the stand, back straight, hands folded neatly in her lap. Stella guided her through the story, allowing Maya to speak with calm, precise authority. She described the stop, the search, the threats, all without embellishment, each detail landing like a stone in a still pond. Then came the cross-examination. Hastings approached, her smile tight. "Ms. Whittaker, you're a lawyer, correct?" "Yes." "You work for the Department of Justice?" "Yes." Hastings' smile sharpened. "Do you think being a lawyer places you above the law?" "No," Maya said evenly. "It gives me a deeper understanding of the law, including my rights during a traffic stop." The room stirred slightly. "Why didn't you tell the officers you were a federal prosecutor?" Hastings pressed. Maya's expression didn't waver. "Because I shouldn't have to announce my profession to be treated with respect. My rights don't depend on my job title." The silence that followed was thunderous. Stella stood again. "Ms. Whittaker, just to clarify for the record, have you ever been arrested before this incident?" "Never," Maya said. "Any history of violence? Resistance?" "None." Stella turned to the judge. "Your Honor, we would like to submit into evidence Ms. Whittaker's personnel file from the DOJ, a record of impeccable service and professionalism." Carver glanced at Hastings, who knew better than to object. The file was entered. As Maya stepped down, she saw Millstone and Rourke for what they truly were, men who had mistaken her silence for submission, who had no idea the storm they'd awakened. This was only the beginning. Cracks in the wall. The courtroom's stale air felt heavier than it had at the start of the hearing, like it was absorbing the weight of every word spoken, every revelation peeled back under questioning. Maya Whittaker sat at the defense table, her hands clasped, her expression composed. On the inside, her mind was a live wire. The preliminary hearing had already delivered a few key victories. Rourke's contradictions, Millstone's stiff discomfort, and the subtle shift in the jury's body language when Maya revealed her position as an assistant U.S. attorney. None of it was enough to guarantee justice yet, but the cracks were forming, and Maya knew how to exploit cracks. Beside her, Stella Moreno flipped through her notes, her pen tapping out a silent rhythm against the table. Each tap was a countdown to the next strike. The day's witnesses had already exposed far more than the prosecution intended. Keisha Brown, the bystander who had recorded part of the traffic stop, had given damning testimony earlier. Her voice had trembled slightly on the stand, but her words landed clean. Maya was calm. Maya followed orders. The officers were aggressive from the start, but the biggest blow had been the pattern evidence Stella had fought to admit. Millstone and Rourke's history, 3 prior complaints, all from black and brown drivers who described eerily similar encounters, was now on the record. Though Judge Carver initially resisted, Stella had argued that establishing a pattern of behavior wasn't character assassination. It was context. Even Carver, with his thin patience and thinly veiled bias, couldn't completely deny the relevance. Now, with both sides presenting their final motions before the hearing adjourned, Maya's heart pounded in quiet anticipation. Hastings rose first, her heels clicking against the tile like gunshots. Her arguments were dry, professional, and mechanical. The officers acted in accordance with their training. Ms. Whittaker's reactions were defensive, combative, and suspicious. She relied heavily on the officers' word, painting them as hard-working public servants maligned by a defendant who, in her words, knew how to manipulate the law to her advantage. Maya's fingers tightened beneath the table. Manipulate. The word hit her like a slap. The suggestion that knowing her rights, asserting them, was somehow deceitful. Because for people like her, Knowledge itself was seen as a threat. When Hastings finally sat down, Judge Carver's gaze shifted to Stella. "Defense, your closing motion." Stella rose, her posture effortless and fluid, the embodiment of calm authority. "Your Honor," she began, "this case is not about a routine traffic stop. It's about abuse of power wrapped in the language of procedure. Officers Millstone and Rourke didn't stop Ms. Whittaker because of her speed. They stopped her because they could, because they assumed they were dealing with another driver too scared, too powerless to question them." Hastings shifted uncomfortably. "My client did exactly what every driver is told to do during a traffic stop," Stella continued. "She followed instructions. She stayed calm. She asked legitimate questions, the kind of questions the Constitution gives her every right to ask. And for that, she was humiliated, threatened, and falsely accused." Stella turned to the jury, her voice softening. "We've shown you the inconsistencies between the officer's own statements. We've shown you evidence of a pattern of racial profiling and escalation by these same officers. And we've shown you that Ms. Whittaker has an impeccable record, not just as a citizen, but as a federal attorney who upholds the very laws she's now accused of violating." Her voice lowered, almost conversational. "This case is about whether we let power go unchecked, whether we allow the people meant to protect us to rewrite reality when the truth doesn't suit them." She let the silence linger for a beat. "We are asking the court to dismiss these charges in full." Judge Carver's expression didn't shift, but Maya saw the flicker of discomfort in his eyes. The courtroom had become too public, the stakes too high. Whatever backroom loyalty he may have had to Millstone and Rourke, the presence of the press, the pattern evidence, and Maya's federal credentials were turning a simple hearing into something much bigger. "Motion under advisement," Carver said curtly, before banging his gavel. Court adjourned. The moment the session ended, the air seemed to shift. Reporters who had quietly filled the back row surged toward Maya and Stella, cameras flashing, microphones extended. "Maya, did you expect to be arrested that day? Do you believe race played a role? How does your position with the DOJ affect this case?" Stella raised a hand, shielding Maya as they pushed through the crowd. "No comment," Stella said firmly. But Maya paused at the courthouse steps, her hands curling at her sides. For weeks, she kept her public silence, playing the respectable, quiet professional. That silence hadn't protected her. It never had. She turned back toward the cameras. "I believe this case is about more than me," she said, her voice steady despite the knot in her chest. "It's about accountability. It's about ensuring that power is never absolute, and that even those with badges must answer to the law." The reporters clamored for more, but Maya turned away, her heart racing. She hadn't planned to speak, but she was done shrinking herself to make others comfortable. Later that evening, Maya sat at her kitchen table, her laptop open to a spreadsheet Marcus had sent over. A breakdown of every complaint, lawsuit, and internal review involving Millstone and Rourke. The sheer volume was staggering. Many cases never made it past preliminary review. Insufficient evidence, conflicting testimony, no sustained findings. But when you lined them up side by side, the same officers, the same types of stops, the same demographic of drivers, a pattern emerged like blood through water. Maya's phone buzzed. It was Marcus. "They're circling the wagons," he said without preamble. "My contact in internal affairs says Millstone and Rourke are part of a clique inside the precinct. They call themselves the Watchdogs. They target drivers of color near certain traffic corridors, mostly Black and Latino neighborhoods. They pull them over, escalate if they ask questions, and pad their arrest numbers with bogus charges." Maya's stomach churned. Why hasn't anyone exposed it? "Because the complaints never leave the precinct," Marcus said. "Most of the drivers can't afford lawyers. They plead out, take the hit, and it disappears. Until me," Maya said quietly. "Until you," Marcus confirmed. "And now, Internal Affairs is watching. And the Civil Rights Division is considering stepping in." Maya's pulse quickened. This wasn't just about her case anymore. It was about cracking open the culture of silence that let officers like Millstone and Rourke thrive. "I'm not backing down," she said. "You never do," Marcus replied. The next morning, Maya met with Stella in her downtown office. On the table between them were two thick folders, one with Maya's personal case, the other labeled simply, Pattern and Practice Investigation, Eastern District Police Department. "They're watching us," Stella said, gesturing toward the window. Across the street, a black sedan was parked, engine idling. "Millstone's crew doesn't like losing." Maya's smile was grim. "Let them watch." She slid the second folder into her briefcase. "Tomorrow," Maya said, "we stop playing defense. When the system blinks first." Maya Whittaker stood in front of the mirror in her small Brooklyn apartment, tugging her blazer into place. Today was different. This wasn't the quiet, polite defense strategy she'd been planning. This wasn't about damage control. Today, Maya was done being the respectable defendant. Today, Maya Whittaker was going to make the system flinch. The weight of her decision sat heavy on her shoulders, but it wasn't fear that made her heart beat faster. It was the thrill of knowing she was no longer playing on their turf. She was dragging them onto hers. The courthouse hallways were loud with foot traffic, but Maya moved through them in silence, her heels clicking evenly against the polished floor. She wasn't alone. Beside her was Stella Moreno, her fierce as hell defense attorney, but on her other side was Marcus Reed, her longtime friend and now unofficial strategist. Marcus wasn't here in an official capacity, but his presence, a Department of Justice civil rights attorney walking in with the defendant, sent a message. And messages mattered when you were fighting not just two crooked cops, but the entire culture that had protected them for years. "Today's the day you draw blood," Marcus said softly as they reached the courtroom doors. "You ready?" Maya's lips curled into a faint smile. "I've been ready since the sidewalk." They stepped inside. The room was already packed, not just with reporters who had gotten wind that Maya Whittaker, the assistant U.S. attorney turned defendant, was about to make her next move, but with observers from Internal Affairs, the local police oversight board, and even a junior representative from the Civil Rights Division. That wasn't an accident. Maya had spent the past week quietly inviting eyes into this room. If Millstone and Rourke thought this was just about humiliating one black woman on the side of the road, they were about to learn they'd stepped into a much bigger fight. At the prosecution table, Millstone and Rourke sat stiffly, their uniforms just a bit too perfect. Their lawyer, Assistant District Attorney Caroline Hastings, glanced at Maya with thinly veiled irritation, as if Maya's very existence was an inconvenience in her otherwise orderly career. "Your Honor," Hastings said, standing, "before we begin today's testimony, the people would like to reiterate our position that this case is straightforward. Ms. Whittaker resisted a lawful stop, obstructed law enforcement in the performance of their duty, and failed to comply with multiple commands." Maya didn't flinch. Stella rose smoothly. "Your Honor, we will show that not only is that account inaccurate, but that officers Millstone and Rourke have a documented pattern of targeting black drivers, falsifying reports, and escalating routine stops into arrests without cause. We are no longer talking about an isolated incident. We are talking about a pattern of unconstitutional policing." Judge Carver's face tightened, and for a moment, Maya saw the flicker of discomfort she was counting on. No judge wants their courtroom to become the epicenter of a civil rights scandal. "Ms. Moreno," Carver said, "this is not a civil rights trial. Let's keep our focus on the charges at hand." "Of course, Your Honor," Stella said sweetly, "but context is everything." Maya's name was called to the stand. She walked with measured grace, taking her seat with the calm of someone who knew she was the smartest person in the room. Stella's first question was simple. "Ms. Whittaker, for the record, can you state your occupation?" "I am an assistant U.S. attorney for the Eastern District of New York." The courtroom stirred. "And in that role, what is your area of focus?" "Civil rights enforcement." constitutional law, and law enforcement oversight. The air in the room shifted. It wasn't just that Maya had power. It was that Maya's specific expertise was the very issue at hand. She wasn't just a defendant. She was an expert witness in her own defense. Stella let that settle before continuing. When Officers Millstone and Rourke stopped you, did you inform them of your occupation? No. Why not? Because my rights shouldn't depend on my job title. Every citizen, no matter their profession, race, or background, has the same constitutional protections. Hastings objected, muttering something about speechifying, but Carver let it slide. The room was too quiet, the stakes suddenly too high. Stella moved on. After the stop, you conducted some research into these officers, correct? Yes. And what did you find? Maya lifted the folder placed in front of her. These are internal complaint records, obtained through a legal records request. Officers Millstone and Rourke have been the subject of at least 7 formal complaints in the last 5 years, all alleging similar conduct: racial profiling, unconstitutional searches, excessive force, and falsified reports. Stella took the folder and approached the bench, handing it directly to Carver. These complaints, Stella said, her voice cutting through the silence, were either dismissed or marked unsubstantiated. However, when cross-referenced with demographic data from the precinct, we found that nearly all the complainants were Black or Latino drivers stopped in neighborhoods classified as high enforcement corridors. Maya's pulse pounded, but her voice stayed smooth. In other words, officers like Millstone and Rourke were padding their arrest numbers at the expense of drivers of color. Carver's face had gone slightly pale. The reporters in the back were writing furiously. "This is not a theory," Maya continued. "This is data. This is a pattern. And that pattern didn't begin or end with me." Stella turned to the jury. "We will be submitting this evidence formally and requesting that the court consider whether these officers' testimony, already riddled with inconsistencies, is reliable at all." Hastings was on her feet. "Objection. This is turning into a civil trial." Stella turned back smoothly. "With all due respect, Your Honor, this is a credibility issue. The prosecution is asking this court to believe the word of these officers. We are showing that their word has a documented pattern of being unreliable." Carver's fingers tapped against the bench. Maya could see the war in his face. Uphold the system, or shield himself from the blowback of suppressing evidence that was now halfway to viral. "Proceed," he said, though his voice was tight. The next hour was devastating. One by one, Stella called witnesses. A retired internal affairs officer who had investigated Millstone years earlier, only to have his findings buried. A civil rights attorney from the NYCLU who testified that her office had received multiple civilian complaints about the same officers, all with nearly identical allegations. And finally, Maya herself. As she sat on the stand, hands folded neatly in her lap, she made no plea for sympathy. No tears, no tremble, only facts. "When they pulled me over, I was not afraid because I'd done something wrong," Maya said. "I was afraid because I knew, even if I followed every command, complied with every order, it might not be enough." Her voice was steady, but her words hung in the air like a thundercloud. "Because for people who look like me, compliance has never been a guarantee of safety." The courtroom was silent. When the session adjourned, Maya didn't rush out. She stood, gathering her papers slowly, deliberately. Millstone and Rourke wouldn't look at her. Their lawyer muttered urgently between them, no doubt recalibrating. Outside the courthouse, the press swarmed again, but this time, Maya didn't speak. She didn't need to. The story was already out there. The next morning, Marcus called her. "They're opening a full-scale pattern and practice investigation into the precinct," he said, breathless with excitement. "They're looking at every complaint, every arrest, every officer in that unit." Maya exhaled, feeling the weight shift, not gone, but lighter. One case wouldn't change the world, But sometimes one case cracked the foundation just enough for the light to get in. And Maya Whittaker was all light. The verdict, the reckoning, and the spark. The morning air outside Kings County Criminal Court was thick with humidity and tension. The clouds hung low, a dull gray blanket over the city, as if the sky itself was holding its breath. Maya Whittaker stood on the courthouse steps, her hands folded before her, the steady pulse of adrenaline beating under her skin. This was the day they would decide whether she would walk out the front doors a free woman or find herself shackled by the very system she had once served. But Maya knew, deep in her bones, that her fate had already been sealed the moment officers Millstone and Rourke had picked the wrong black woman to target. This case was no longer about a traffic stop. It was a mirror, forcing the city, the precinct, and even the courts to look at themselves. Whether they liked the reflection or not was irrelevant. Ready? Stella Moreno stood beside her, her crimson lipstick a small act of defiance in a world of muted tones. Her briefcase was packed with everything they'd gathered. The complaints, the pattern analysis, the damning testimonies, and above all, Maya's own unflinching words. More than ready, Maya said softly. She wasn't smiling, but there was something in her eyes, something resolute. This fight was bigger than today. Inside, the courtroom buzzed with tension. Reporters filled the benches, pens poised. Activists and civil rights attorneys from across the boroughs squeezed into the back rows. Even a representative from the Department of Justice Civil Rights Division sat quietly near the side, his presence both silent support and subtle warning. The entire city was watching. Judge Carver took his seat, the deep furrow between his brows more pronounced than usual. Maya couldn't tell if it was annoyance or unease, but either way, she had him off balance. The system thrived on silence, and Maya had been anything but silent. Docket number 24, CR 1785. The clerk announced, "The people of the state of New York versus Maya Whittaker." The words rang out like the opening bell of a title fight. Maya rose slowly, Stella at her side. Across the aisle, Millstone and Rourke sat stiffly, their hands clasped in their laps, their eyes darting toward the press with nervous flickers. Their lawyer, ADA Caroline Hastings, tried to exude calm, but Maya could see the faint tremor in her fingers as she adjusted her notes. The truth had shaken them. Whether it would be enough to break them remained to be seen. "Ladies and gentlemen," Judge Carver began, his tone heavier than usual, "we have reviewed the evidence, heard the testimonies, and examined the supplemental records provided by both parties. This court is now ready to render its decision." The room collectively held its breath. Maya felt the heat of 1,000 eyes pressing against her, but she stood tall. This wasn't the first time she'd faced down power. And it wouldn't be the last. "On the charge of resisting arrest," Carver said, his gaze flicking briefly to Maya before returning to his papers, "the court finds the defendant, Maya Whittaker, not guilty." A burst of whispers rippled through the room, but Carver wasn't done. "On the charge of obstruction of governmental administration, the court finds the defendant, Maya Whittaker, not guilty." Maya exhaled, her composure holding even as her fingers tightened slightly against the edge of the table. Beside her, Stella allowed herself the faintest smile. But then Carver's voice shifted, lower, heavier, almost reluctant. "This court is also recommending that the Kings County District Attorney's Office conduct an immediate review of the actions taken by officers Troy Millstone and Kevin Rourke, particularly in light of the pattern of conduct introduced into evidence during these proceedings." The room erupted into murmurs, a mix of shock, satisfaction, and disbelief. "Furthermore," Carver continued, "the court will forward all relevant documentation, including prior complaints, to the Department of Justice Civil Rights Division for further review under potential pattern and practice violations." Maya's breath caught. This was more than just her freedom. This was the system being forced, for once, to look at itself. The gavel struck wood, and the case was closed. Maya was free. But the battle was only beginning. The fallout begins. The walk out of the courtroom was surreal. Cameras flashed, microphones thrust forward, voices calling her name from all directions. Maya, how do you feel? Do you think this changes anything? What would you say to Officers Millstone and Rourke? Maya paused, the sun breaking briefly through the clouds to catch her in its light. She faced the sea of press, her hands clasped before her voice calm but deliberate. This case was never just about me, she said. It's about a system that protects itself at the expense of the people it's supposed to serve. It's about the countless people who look like me, who've been silenced, humiliated, and criminalized for nothing more than asking why. She let the weight of her words settle before continuing. The system tried to make me small, but I'm not small. None of us are. She didn't answer any further questions. She didn't need to. The truth had already taken root. The internal rot. Behind the scenes, the fallout was immediate. The NYPD's Internal Affairs Bureau opened a formal misconduct investigation into Millstone and Rourke, re-examining every complaint they had managed to bury. Other officers, emboldened by the spotlight, came forward with stories of internal quotas, racial profiling pressure, and the unwritten rules that kept the watchdogs, Millstone and Rourke's clique, insulated from consequence. Maya had forced the door open, and now the flood was pouring through. Within 2 weeks, Millstone and Rourke were suspended without pay. By the end of the month, they were fired, the first officers in that precinct to lose their jobs over racial profiling in nearly a decade. But Maya wasn't done. The federal firestorm. The Department of Justice Civil Rights Division, spurred in part by the evidence Maya and Marcus had compiled, announced the opening of a full pattern and practice investigation into the precinct, one that would examine not just Millstone and Rourke, but the entire culture that had allowed them to thrive. The investigation unearthed evidence of racially biased traffic stops, quotas tied to arrests of Black and Latino drivers, a pattern of escalating minor stops into arrests to justify searches, suppressed civilian complaints and retaliatory charges against drivers who pushed back. It wasn't just about 2 cops anymore. It was about the system that built them. The faces behind the numbers. Maya didn't retreat back into anonymity after her case ended. Instead, she became a bridge, connecting the Civil Rights Division investigators to the people whose stories had been buried. She sat in community centers, church basements, and cramped apartments, listening to mothers, brothers, and children tell stories almost identical to her own. Each story added weight to her resolve. Maya had survived because she knew the law inside and out. Others hadn't been so lucky. She vowed to change that. The spark. A year later, Maya stood on the steps of City Hall, not as a defendant, but as an advocate. The City Council had just passed a community oversight bill, establishing an independent civilian review board with subpoena power, a direct result of the public pressure her case had ignited. This fight isn't over, Maya told the crowd gathered at her feet. But today we took one step closer to making sure no one else has to stand alone. The applause was deafening. Legacy. Long after the cameras stopped rolling, Maya Whittaker kept fighting. In courtrooms, in policy meetings, in quiet conversations with the next generation of young Black lawyers who saw in her a blueprint for their own resistance. She was proof that the system could be made to blink. If you stood tall enough, if you spoke loud enough, if you refused to disappear. They had tried to make her small. She became a giant.